Hello, my name is Anthony Patch, and this is another edition of Pulse. The title of this short, brief introduction to about an hour and 15-minute, hour and a half presentation, which is available here on our YouTube channel, but to a greater degree is explained behind our paywall by way of subscription, available through anthonypatch.com. This brief introduction on YouTube is entitled Pulse, Greenland, and Conversation. I'm recording this introduction on the 22nd. On the 20th is the actual presentation, which is an excerpt from one of our live streams. Typically, as scheduled, 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday evenings from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we provide to our subscribers a much longer discussion than is typically presented in the Pulse videos here on YouTube. The reason for the subscription is because there are community guidelines, as you well know, on YouTube. And within our own private forum, we are able to speak about topics to a much broader and deeper degree than we are permitted here within the guidelines that we adhere to on YouTube. Therefore, Pulse. Today, I'd like to introduce to you topics that we did discuss on the 20th. Today is Thursday, the 22nd. So on Tuesday, to a much deeper degree, and will be continued tonight, the 22nd, at anthonypatch.com in our live stream, the following topics: the North American Union and tokenization. That's a very deep discussion. Japan and the yen carry trade and the bond market in Japan, which is affecting the global bond market, including that of the United States and the U.S. stock market. And finally, Iran, which includes the U.S. and Israel, and the distinct possibility that the U.S. and Israel may employ nuclear warheads, nuclear weapons against Iran in this soon to materialize strike against Iran. This will be precipitated by Israel and the United States together. But let me focus for a moment on Greenland and our conversation that we began on Tuesday and will continue tonight. Now that the WEF at Davos has had a few days, today is Thursday, they've been meeting since Monday. Some of the comments that came out yesterday from President Trump and the accompanying comments that came from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the EU in general, and in particular, Denmark. Greenland is more about the North American Union. Now, if you've not heard of that, this union will consist, and this is the written plan, will consist of Canada, Greenland, the United States itself, Mexico, and Central America. This is what is forming right now. All of the bluster, all of the cover stories about national security, rare earth metals, which I disclosed the central rare earth metal that is really the focus of attention and contention when you're talking about Greenland and the acquisition of Greenland by the United States. It has more to do with the particular metal, rare earth metal, that I disclosed in our last live stream on Tuesday and went into some depth to discuss its strategic implications for the U.S. But even larger than rare earth metals, including gold and silver and others, even larger than the military strategic necessity as outlined by President Trump, is the financial, is the economic. We all know that the United States is running a greater than $38 trillion deficit. We know that every country on the planet within this debt-based system are operating in a deficit. That includes, even though China just released today their figures on their trade, they have a significant trade surplus, but they are still running a deficit in terms of governmental spending. The planned solution that I will elaborate on tonight, and our subscribers have already heard in great depth the background to this topic, but I will bring it to the more current status tonight, is the subject of tokenization. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, briefly explained, this is the digitizing of real-world assets, not just gold and silver and the aforementioned rare earth metals and so forth, but literally from the standpoint of a fiat debt-based monetary system, a global system, their solution to the debt-based system, the so-called reset, which again, WEF has been meeting this week. They have continued to talk about the reset. The mechanics of that reset are specific to the tokenization, in their minds, in their words, the tokenization of everything. In other words, when you convert everything in our reality, all of the physical material, even in the natural environment, not just commodities, when you tokenize, when you represent the material world that we interface with in a digital manner and assign a value to each of those individual items with their individual tokens, when you assign a value, you wipe out all the debts. It also means, as Klaus Schwab indicated in June of 2020, and we've reported extensively on this since then within the pages of our magazine, Entangled magazine, we will own nothing as individuals, as private citizens. He stated we would own nothing, but we would be happy for that because all the debts would be eliminated. Everything would go to zero. What is not understood in that equation, as I characterize his statement as a coin, and the opposite side of that coin, the front facing that he addresses are debts. The opposite side of the coin are assets. What needs to be understood and is poorly understood, poorly recognized, and not cited by the likes of Klaus Schwab and others at the WEF or the IMF or any of the central banks, is that all assets are derived from debts. Thus, when you eliminate all debts, you likewise eliminate all assets. That's how we can say you will own nothing. However, it's questionable whether anyone's going to be happy about it. They may initially be happy. That initial response, emotional response, may be, hey, my debts are gone. We can understand that. But when the shock hits everyone that their assets have also been eliminated, that means you own nothing. So we will elaborate on that in tonight's conversation, Thursday, the 22nd of January. We will closely examine tokenization, governmental sovereign debt, as well as sovereign so-called wealth funds. We will talk about Japan and the yen carry trade and the bond market, the effects of what is occurring in the Japanese economy and its banking system, its effects upon the United States, our economy, our stock market, our bond market, and deficit spending on the part of the United States government, whether the government will be able to continue without declaring default on its obligations, whether it will be able to continue to pay on those obligations in the very near term. And finally, we will look at the looming threat. I'm not saying this is an absolute, but look at the looming threat of the use by Israel and the United States in the initial attack on Iran, the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That's not fear-mongering. I'm simply reporting on the reports that are being disclosed as of today, the 22nd. So please join us through anthonypatch.com if you're interested in more information on these topics. We have the benefit of taking our time, not rushing through. We drill down through the layers on our given topics, which range from quantum mechanics and particle physics to microbiology and genealogy and genetics and bioengineering, all the way to economics and geopolitical affairs. Thank you for your time and attention. God bless you all. So our discussion on Greenland and really what is going on behind the scenes that is one of the principal reasons that Donald Trump is seeking ownership by whatever means, ownership of Greenland, I want to share with you today. And again, this is a geopolitical discussion which affects the economics of the United States as well as for Greenland and Denmark. There's one particular rare earth metal that is behind this clamor for control over Greenland by the United States. This is a rare earth metal that goes by the name of dysprosium. Now, about 2 weeks ago, I introduced to our subscribers here in a live stream dysprosium, but it was just a brief introduction. Tonight, what I would like to do is to give you a deeper definition, explanation of it, and what its importance is that makes it so highly sought after. But it is interesting in contrast to its obvious, as you'll see as we progress, its obvious importance is the lack of attention in the mainstream media and even the lack of citation by the president himself. But that's not uncommon. That is not untypical, that it is obfuscated. So I'm going to read some of the basic description, definition of this rare earth metal, but it's very interesting. Its atomic number is 66. It's not far from 666 of Satan, of the Antichrist. Dysprosium is a silvery, relatively stable, rare earth metal with atomic number 66 and is valued for its magnetic properties. It is used in high-performance magnets for electronics, robotics, and defense, as well as in nuclear reactors and high-intensity lighting, deriving its name from the Greek for hard to get, due to its difficult extraction from minerals like monazite. While it lacks a known biological role and soluble salts have mild toxicity, the insoluble forms are considered non-toxic with large doses needed to risk harm in experimental mice. Now, I want to focus for just a moment. There are a number of things. In particular, we're going to be talking about the magnets. But when we look at nuclear reactors, dysprosium oxide is used in control rods for neutron absorption. You see, in a fissile reaction, fission reaction involving uranium or plutonium, you have a rapid production of neutrons. Well, in order to control that nuclear reaction, you have control rods that will absorb those neutrons, thus slowing the reaction and cooling the reactor, so to speak, in addition to water, of course. But when I provide you with this emphasis on control rods, we need to think about artificial intelligence and data centers. The energy requirements for data centers, electrical energy, the generation of that electricity. This going back about 4 months, we introduced subscribers to small modular reactors. Reactors that literally, as a complete system, a complete unit, would fit into, they're designed to fit into a 40-foot shipping container, like you would see traveling down the road on a tractor-trailer rig. These are nuclear reactors. They require control rods. Those control rods require dysprosium. Now, the other that we need to consider are powerful magnets. So as we get into this, we'll talk more about the magnets, but magnets that specifically are used in military applications, even more specifically in missiles, and even more specifically, nuclear-tipped missiles, tactical and strategic being typically intercontinental ballistic missiles. So you can see why this is so highly sought after. But letting that information out that I just shared with you for nuclear reactors and for military applications is not something that the government and the media, one in one, hand in hand, do not want the general public, and I don't mean just in the United States, but the general public at large around the world to know much about the true agenda of acquiring Greenland. Now, you know the story that is put out in the media that President Trump says it's of strategic necessity for national security of the United States, and so forth and so on. And as I observe him making statements like that, it's very interesting that he is exhibiting almost a near state of panic when he says, we're just going to take it. He doesn't want to engage in the questions, in the controversies about international law. And as he has said in response to a reporter recently in the White House in the press conference, when asked, is there, for instance, any international law that can stop what you want to do, whatever it may be? Again, I'm paraphrasing, but he said essentially in response, he used his own morals, that he doesn't need international law. He has his own morals to guide his decisions. Well, from that standpoint, he makes the unilateral decision that the United States is just going to take Greenland. Doesn't matter what European leaders, European militaries, NATO and the like, what the international community has to say about it. The United Kingdom sent 1 soldier to Greenland. France sent 12. And all of these troops, I think there were 15 from another country, they were there for 48 hours, and then they packed their bags and went home. There's really not going to be any military operation in opposition to Donald Trump's agenda, but it's not his agenda alone. But again, I want to emphasize that it appears that he is nearly in a state of panic to move quickly on this aggressive acquisition of a sovereign nation. It's not just political. Let's go to magnetism for a moment. Dysprosium has one of the highest magnetic strengths of any element. It is paramagnetic at room temperature, but becomes ferromagnetic at temperatures below 90 degrees Kelvin or minus 183 degrees centigrade. We'll read a little more about the magnets using dysprosium. Where is dysprosium found in the world? About 3,100 tons of dysprosium were provided and produced worldwide in 2021, with 40% of that total produced in China and 31% in Myanmar, excuse the pronunciation, Myanmar, and 20% in Australia. Now, it doesn't mention Greenland in this particular search. The U.S. is actively building a domestic rare earth refining industry through significant government funding from the Department of Energy and Department of Defense and private investment, focusing on reducing reliance on China with major projects underway in Louisiana, Texas, and Utah. Right now, they are talking about the refinement for things like zinc. But these same plants, Louisiana, Texas, and Utah, and Wyoming, are for the extraction of rare earth metals, including dysprosium. These are separation and processing plants for magnets and defense. The aim is for mine-to-magnet self-sufficiency for the United States by 2027. So you can see why he gets a little anxious about getting on with this acquisition. There's a very tight timetable for the U.S. from a military standpoint, but also from the energy requirements for the data centers. Data centers are not only for the processing of inquiries, parameters that are entered into an AI system, but they are for the building of learning models for the advancement of AI systems. So there's two key dual roles to the data centers. One is to process information in order to provide answers to queries, but also for the advancement of AI by advancing the state of learning models. Those that are more complex, more dense in data, and those that advance the activities of AI is the second part of data centers. Those require tremendous amounts of electricity. Small modular reactors. Dysprosium. Kind of giving you the crib notes here, okay? So what about magnets? Dysprosium is crucial in industry for boosting the performance of neodymium iron boron magnets. Oftentimes I run across these magnets. They're often described as niobium magnets as a shorthand. So boosting the performance of these magnets, enhancing their heat resistance and power for electric vehicle motors and wind turbine generators and defense systems. This is typically in the guidance systems of missiles and is used in nuclear reactor control rods for neutron absorption, plus lasers, data storage, and advanced optics. Those would be laser-based systems like laser weapons systems. These would be anti-ballistic missile systems utilizing lasers. Interestingly, Israel has recently been releasing more information about their advanced laser defense systems because of the looming conflict with Iran. They're making it known. They have more than just missiles in their Iron Dome. They have laser systems. Well, that requires dysprosium. Anybody doing a quick search on this, there's a lot of information available that fits right into the Greenland agenda. I'll spell that in case you want to do your own search. dysprosium, dysprosium. Now, this is from the website aemree.com. Rare earth metals, oxides, alloys, compounds, nanomaterials, and magnets from January of last year. The incredible uses of dysprosium empowering high-tech and green energy solutions. That would be the windmill application for turbines that generate electricity. Okay. Dysprosium is a rare earth metal primarily used to enhance magnetic performance, thermal stability, and durability in advanced materials. It is best known for its role in high-performance permanent magnets, where dysprosium improves resistance to demagnetization at elevated temperatures. These properties make dysprosium essential for technologies that operate under extreme conditions. The main uses of dysprosium include permanent magnets, nuclear reactors, lighting and laser systems, data storage, aerospace materials, as catalysts, energy storage, and optical applications. As demand grows for high efficiency and low carbon technologies, dysprosium has become increasingly important in modern manufacturing and green energy solutions. What makes dysprosium unique is its scarcity and its application in critical industries. Despite being classified as a rare earth element, it is relatively abundant in the Earth's crust. However, its dispersed occurrence makes extraction challenging, thus adding to its value. Industries rely on dysprosium for its exceptional magnetic properties and thermal stability. These properties are crucial in applications ranging from electric vehicles to cutting-edge data storage devices. Now, that would include data centers, okay? I don't want to read too much to you. That gets boring. I think we've hit the high points on this. Electric vehicle growth, renewable energy expansion, and advanced technology such as innovations in robotics, aerospace, and AI-driven devices are further fueling demand. The environmental concerns and recycling and sustainability, and the geopolitical constraints. A significant portion of rare earth mining is concentrated in specific regions. This concentration creates a constant risk of supply disruptions. Now, if we look at the geopolitical state of affairs right now in the world, where, for example, the United States, through President Trump, continues to reinforce the notion, the concept that China, for one, is an enemy of the United States. And the withholding of dysprosium, along with other rare earth metals by China in response to a number of factors, none of least are the trade embargoes and the tariffs and the sanctions imposed by the U.S. government on China. Their response has been to cut off rare earth metals to the United States. We look at the recent events by way of the U.S. military in Venezuela. Venezuela also has a high concentration of rare earth metals. But this puts Greenland as low-hanging fruit. They don't have a standing military. They don't have a large population. It's next door to the United States. It is slated to be part of the North American Union, including Canada and Mexico and Central America. So its acquisition is something that on a larger scale, larger picture of things, its acquisition by the United States is already planned for. That's not conspiratorial. Simply look up, do your own research on the North American Union. That will include Greenland in that description. So low-hanging fruit. The only military, so to speak, is Denmark. We've seen a little bit of the NATO response, as I just illustrated. But if we look at it geopolitically, and if you will, from a military standpoint as well, Denmark, therefore Greenland, is part of NATO. Within NATO, there is an Article 5 that stipulates that if one member of NATO is threatened or attacked, that the other members of NATO will come to that nation's aid. Now, there's a misunderstanding out there that this is automatic on the part of other NATO members responding. Article 5 stipulates that other member nations are given the option as to whether or not they will, in a military manner, come to the aid of a threatened country, member of NATO. So you have an interesting dynamic here where you have the United States, which of course is the founder of NATO, founding nation, following World War II, threatening another NATO member, specifically Denmark. So the question is, will other NATO countries exercise that option to come to the aid of Denmark/Greenland? Well, this is why you see the token response by handfuls of military troops from Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. That was NATO responding, Article 5. And then they left. It's much ado about nothing. It's a fait accompli. It's a foregone conclusion that the United States will acquire Greenland. From a perspective of international law, from the perspective of the United States being a founder and signator to the United Nations and founder of NATO, is it not ironic that the United States is leading this effort to acquire another sovereign nation, to defy NATO itself, to defy the UN itself, to violate international law with impunity? Now, for our subscribers, we have spent several live streams talking about the U.S. Constitution, specific to treaties, international law, and a president operating essentially, as I observe it and analyze his behavior, his actions, that he's acting with an attitude of impunity. Again, reflected in his comment of he doesn't need international law to determine his actions. He has his own morals. Well, of course, the question is, what is his moral basis for his decisions and thus his actions? Well, when we see that he is obviously in violation of international law in the acquisition of Greenland, that answers the question about the state of his morals. But this acting with impunity extends beyond just Greenland. Look at Venezuela. Look at the small boats and the occupants of the small boats that have been destroyed. Look at the piracy on the high seas in the Gulf of America of Venezuelan oil tankers, stealing the tankers themselves and keeping them, retaining them, as well as their cargo. There was some $500 million worth of oil sold by the United States, and the money deposited in Qatar. Some people pronounce it Qatar. That money came from the sale of that stolen Venezuelan oil, never entered into the U.S. banking system or the U.S. Treasury. It went straight to Qatar. That was to protect those funds from international court rulings against the United States government, who would be forced in an international court to return those funds to the legitimate owner of the oil, which, of course, would have been the government of Venezuela, acting with impunity. We're going to see a lot more of that from this president. The arguments that he puts forth and some of his cohorts put forth is that this is of strategic value to the United States for national security. Again, pointing the fingers at Russia and China as the identified enemy, that should Russia and China establish even more military bases, outposts on Greenland, that would pose a strategic threat, national security threat to the United States mainland. Now, an argument can be made in favor of that. We can understand that. But we have to look at Russia and China and ask the question, are they truly aggressors? Are they imperialist governments? Are they truly trying to spread on a military basis, spread their influence with military bases in Greenland? The United States has over 800 military bases all over the world. China has a handful. Russia has a handful. Yes, we could get into a debate and analysis of Ukraine, but that isn't necessary. The point is, they're not expansionist from a military perspective. They are not expansionist nations, Russia and China. They are more prone, their goals, their objectives are trade-related objectives. Trade for profit, trade for their people, trade for national security rather than military for national security. Yes, they have significant standing armies. They are nuclear powers. We don't need to be naive about this discussion. But in terms of Greenland, Russia has 2 or 3 outposts, very small, in Greenland. China, I think, has 2. But again, they're very small footprints. And they're more for research and exploratory purposes as opposed to military purposes. During the Cold War, we had some 50 military bases on Greenland. These were listening posts and forward operating bases and Air Force installations. Thule to the north is the only active U.S. military airfield in Greenland. With the end of the Cold War, these other bases were all disbanded. So we've been there before, but we've done this cooperatively, the U.S. And it begs the question, why cannot the United States do this in a similar fashion that Russia and China have done this in Greenland? Peaceably, with treaties, with trade agreements, with both. Treaties typically involve military agreements. Trade agreements are self-evident. Why can't this be done peaceably? You remember Trump said during his campaign for his second term in office that in mentioning Greenland, he was talking about it in terms of buying Greenland, paying the indigenous peoples for their land and putting them into a cooperative agreement where they would share in the profits from their land developed through U.S. investments and outright pay Denmark, repay them for some $1 billion of infrastructure investment. Primarily that took place in the capital city. None of that is being offered now. And I go back to my earlier observation. I think the president, because he's just acting on behalf of those that are behind him, be it the banking sector, the military industrial complex, the intelligence community, the powers that be, whatever you want to label it. But he's just acting on orders. He needs to accelerate his acquisition, is what he's been told. That's my summation of his behavior. So going through the process of developing trade agreements takes too much time. The process of negotiating the sale and the sale price, the terms of the sale, there's no time. So he is going to go in and take control, both for the purpose of military installations, for obvious purposes, least of which is to have a military presence that guarantees the freedom of movement in the northern sea routes, moving from the Pacific past the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, across the northern region, northern coastline of Canada, through the Arctic Circle, and eventually reaching the Nordic nations and Europe itself. With the melting of the polar ice cap, that whole northern route has become very usable, very viable. Russia, I believe, currently has some 19 or 20 nuclear-powered icebreakers to keep things open, the shipping lanes open. China is building icebreakers. I think Norway has one icebreaker under construction at the present time for the United States. So this would be air power over that shipping lane that the United States would use to exercise its military influence from northern Greenland. But again, there's the close proximity to both Canada and the United States. It's about 1,000 miles across the water between continental North America and Greenland. But there are other rare earth metals that are contained in Greenland, as well as valuable precious metals including large deposits of gold and silver. So with that backdrop, we go to the topic of strategic sovereign wealth fund. This is something Donald Trump has spoken at length about. A sovereign wealth fund that would serve with the assets deposited into that wealth fund account, assets such as gold and silver, stable coins, literally federal lands, federal properties, making up a basket of assets to back up a stable coin, a cryptocurrency, a digital currency. Greenland is also there for that purpose, and you don't hear him talk about that. Excuse me. It's not in the mainstream media. A sovereign wealth fund tied to the Greenland acquisition. My hope is that with U.S. ownership and U.S. investment in Greenland, infrastructure investment, that the people of the indigenous peoples of Greenland, that they are treated fairly, their standard of living increases significantly, and that the environment is not destroyed in the process of mining these materials. As I mentioned earlier, a smelter, a refinery, is used to take the raw material out of the ground, the soil, the rock, grind that rock, and then superheat the rock in order to extract those rare earth metals or not so rare metals from the rock that entraps those metals. So this is what the United States is committed to building. 4 smelters at this point. There probably will be more. So those monies and those plans have already been committed to expanding existing smelters, but to build new ones. So when I said earlier that this is a foregone conclusion that the United States will take ownership, and I emphasize the word take, ownership of Greenland, this has been in the works longer than President Trump was ever in his first term or in this 1 year point in his second term. This has been underway at least for 20 years. It's just been sped up now because the geopolitical environment, which also means the economic environment of the world, is dictating the rapidity at which this acquisition takes place. Let me look at the rest of my notes here. This is from the website grist.org, and this will kind of wrap up our discussion of Greenland. Then I want to talk about the bond market, something we have in our live stream spoken extensively about the bond market for over 2 years, the global bond market. But we'll get to that in just a moment. This is from grist.org. Beneath Greenland's ice lies a climate solution and a new geopolitical battleground. Modern society and the clean energy revolution depend on rare earth elements. Can Greenland help break China's stranglehold on the market? This is from March of last year. This is authored by Matt Simon. Greenland's massive cap of ice containing enough fresh water to raise the sea levels by 23 feet is in serious trouble. Between 2002 and 2023, Greenland lost 270 billion tons of frozen water each year as water snowfall failed to compensate for ever fiercer summer temperatures. That's a significant contributor of sea level rise globally, which is now at 1/4 of an inch a year. But underneath all that melting ice is something the whole world wants: the rare earth elements that make modern society and the clean energy revolution possible. That could soon turn Greenland, which has a population size similar to that of Casper, Wyoming, that's about 38,000 people, into a mining mecca. Greenland's dominant industry has long been fishing, but its government is now looking to diversify its economy. While the island has opened up a handful of mines for gold and rubies, it has built, and natural environment makes drilling a nightmare, with freezing conditions on remote sites without railways or highways for access. The country's rich reserves of rare earths and geopolitical conflict, however, are making the island look increasingly enticing to mining companies. Arctic conditions be damned. When President Donald Trump talks about the United States acquiring Greenland, it's partly for its strategic trade and military location in the Arctic, but also for its mineral resources. According to one Greenland official, the island possesses 39 of the 50 minerals that the United States has classified as critical to national security and economic stability. While the island, an autonomous territory of Denmark, has made it clear it is not for sale, its government is signaling it is open to business, particularly in the mining sector. Earlier this month, Greenland's elections saw the ascendance of the pro-business Democratic Party, which has promised to accelerate the development of the country's minerals and other resources. At the same time, the party's leadership is pushing back hard against Trump's rhetoric. All right, so that's just a short excerpt from his article. But I find it noteworthy that their own Democratic Party wants to do business. But as I have already emphasized, the timeline has been severely shortened. Part of that is economic, the U.S. economy. Second of that are geopolitical influences, in particular, the animosity between the United States and the EU, and the United States, its animosity against NATO as an organization. So I'd like to talk about that for just a moment. But again, the backdrop is time is of the essence, at least from the perspective of President Trump responding to the emphasis being pushed upon him by those that put him in power and control him in power. Time is of the essence. It is interesting that Donald Trump, from the beginning, from the time that he first started campaigning for his first term in office, was talking about withdrawing the United States from NATO. The whole mandate of 5% of a country's GDP within the NATO membership needed to be devoted to the military support of NATO by those European NATO nations, while at the same time, the United States drastically reducing its financial support of NATO. Well, he continued that in his second campaign for his second term, and has of late said NATO is obsolete. What he's not said, but many people that agree with that have said, is that with the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO, in fact, was obsolete. Its mission, whether you want to say it was accomplished or not, its mission dissolved, collapsed with the taking down of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent economic collapse and political collapse of the Soviet Union. So for 10 years, the United States, in particular, the military-industrial complex, treated Russia as subordinate, as a failed state, that its economic power was of no consequence, its political aspirations of no consequence, and that its military was regarded as useless for 10 years. But then Putin came to office, and things have changed dramatically, economically, militarily, politically in Russia. It is now a federation of states. It is very much democratic. It is no longer communist. It is no longer socialist. It is not a dictatorship. It is an elected form of representative government, and they have their own constitution. NATO has outlived its purpose. Therefore, I'm in agreement with the president and many others that NATO should be disbanded. Now, I'm a military vet. I enlisted in the 70s. I spent 2 years of active duty in West Germany during the Cold War. And I was assigned to an isolated military post of 1,100 personnel with the mission of guarding and readying nuclear warheads for tactical nuclear launch against Soviet forces that were in the day anticipated to advance through the Fulda Gap into West Germany. That was NATO then. It's no longer needed now. Now, the EU. President Trump has made it very clear that he is an adversary to the member countries of the EU. This is why you see France, Germany, and England, United Kingdom, deploy a handful of NATO troops into Greenland. It was symbolic. It was their way of saying NATO is still relevant. The EU has sway over NATO, not the United States. That was the message. That the EU leadership determines the fate of Greenland, utilizing Article 5 of the UN Charter, of the NATO Charter. What have I said about the way that President Trump thinks and his actions? He thinks based and makes decisions based, in his own words, based upon his own morals. And he acts, legally speaking, with impunity. NATO is irrelevant to his way of thinking. And again, he represents people that think the same way that he's expressing. It's not just the president. It's not just his administration of appointees. NATO is obsolete, and the EU is irrelevant. This is why the president continues to be at odds, geopolitically speaking, at odds with the EU nations. If we touch just a little bit on Ukraine, the EU has been promising troops and military support and economic support to Ukraine. And they have been talking, the EU, on behalf of Ukraine, have been talking about the monies that are on deposit from Russia and other countries that are in opposition to the EU. like China, monies that are on deposit in central banks in Europe that are used for the purpose of settling cross-border trade agreements. So monies are held in a central bank from another nation. They're supposed to be, by treaty, secure, that country that is holding another country's money will not touch that other country's sovereign funds that are held on account to settle trades, international trade. It's simply a facilitator. It reduces the time in settling those cross-border trades because sovereign currencies do not need to go through a currency exchange process. You don't have to exchange one currency for another. That's already been done by the deposit of a sovereign currency in another country's bank, central bank, and that exchange of currencies at that given exchange rate at that time is already done, already accomplished. Those funds are in a trust account. The emphasis on trust. Now the EU is threatening to violate that trust, confiscate those funds, sovereign funds from other countries, and deposit all of those monies with Ukraine. No wonder President Trump wants to completely pull out of NATO, completely disavow any trade relations and perhaps any political relations, diplomatic relations with member nations of the EU. He's very close to completely cutting off any U.S. financial, much less military support of Ukraine. See, the EU doesn't have the financial capability outside of confiscating sovereign funds, doesn't have the financial capability, and certainly not the military strength to put boots on the ground and economically and militarily continue to support Ukraine for any length of time. Should the U.S. completely cease any support of Ukraine and pull our intelligence officers, our contract operatives, our technical experts, withdraw all of those personnel out of Ukraine itself, the unconditional surrender that I've been expecting for quite some time now to be announced, again, would be a foregone conclusion. Now, I want to go to, in the remaining moments, something about the bond market, because this takes us to a larger perspective on Ukraine, EU, NATO, and the United States. It's financial. The primary accelerant, catalyst, that is shortening up the timeline that results in this obvious pressure on President Trump to steal Greenland is financial. The financial condition of the global economy, but the U.S. financial condition, which is artificially propped up in the bond market. The government finances its debt spending by selling bonds. And I'm shortening down long discussions that subscribers have heard me present over the last 2 years in particular. Well, today, the Japanese bond market is nearly collapsing, something that I have been anticipating with our subscribers for at least 6 months now. There's something that's called the yen carry trade. Again, I'm shortening and being brief here, but we've explained the entirety of the yen carry trade, but the yen carry trade was a way to borrow money that could very inexpensively and reuse that money, those funds gained, in other words, the yen, borrowing it really at 0% interest historically for 30 years, and using that so-called free money to buy U.S. bonds and then enjoy the yield, the interest payments from those bonds. Well, the Japanese have been raising the interest rates on the yen, the borrowing of the yen in the carry trade. They've also been raising the yield, the interest paid on bonds that they sell to finance their government programs. Well, right now, they have just instituted their quantitative easing campaign, which means they are printing money, their treasury, the Bank of Japan, to then use that money to improve the infrastructure of the country, to provide additional financial support for food and medicine to the population, and to provide energy discounts and energy subsidies to the population. Well, this then raises the specter of inflation within Japan. This has resulted in the bond market, especially on the 30-year and 10-year, but focus on the 10-year Japanese bond market. It has just increased its yield by 30 basis points. The yield is up today at 4.43%. Now, what should be appreciated is when the interest rate, the yield, increases, that is for the purpose of enticing investors to buy that higher yield, higher interest paying bond. If the yield was not raised in order to make the bond more attractive, there's the possibility that the bond would go unsold. In other words, there would be a lack of liquidity thus obtained through the sale of the bond that the government could use in a quantitative easing campaign, which they just instituted. So the yield has gone up, but the bond market still has collapsed. Collapsed in the description or definition of collapse, meaning there are a severe lack of buyers of debt, Japanese debt. The ripple effect of that carries out through the entire bond market around the world. Countries around the world sell their debt to other countries. It's one country sells their debt in agreement with, and that country as the buyer agrees to buy that debt, and then that country turns to another country who has the same relationship and says, yes, I will buy your debt. Then they turn around with that greater debt that they've just acquired through that purchase and sell it to another country. And this round robin of circular buying of bonds is the bond market. Well, when a country like Japan suddenly experiences a dramatic increase in the yield in its 10-year short-term bonds and a severe lack of buyers in their bond market, that has a ripple effect in this circular buying process to every nation. But in the last few moments here, I want to focus upon the United States bond market. In the worst case scenario, if the U.S. fails to auction, that's the sale process, to auction new debt, new bonds, of which in 2026, just to make the interest payments on existing debt, the U.S. must auction $3 trillion worth of new bonds. Well, this is a ripple effect into the U.S. bond market by way of what is happening in Japan. The worst case scenario, as I introduced, is that the U.S. government would find itself in a position where it would perhaps default on those interest payments because it wouldn't find sufficient buyers for its newly issued debt, newly issued not for additional spending, but just to cover the existing debt, the interest payments on that existing debt, meaning the bonds that were previously sold into the global marketplace. This is, again, an indication of a catalyst pushing President Trump to acquire Greenland for the purpose of not only the rare earth metals, which have a market value to them, but gold and silver, and the land, the real estate. Here you go. He's a real estate deal maker. The real estate of Greenland. All of this, the value of the real estate, the value of the minerals, etc., even the people of Greenland, and the infrastructure of Greenland, and the investment potential in Greenland in terms of building its economy. All of that value as a package is deposited into the basket of assets that I mentioned to support the value of the coming stablecoin issued by the U.S. government, supported as by a sovereign wealth fund of a basket of assets. It is the sovereign wealth fund that you are going to begin to hear a lot more about in the same arena and discussion of Greenland. Sovereign wealth fund. And with the discussion of sovereign wealth fund, you are going to hear the cryptocurrency from the central bank, from the Federal Reserve, the CBDC. From that, if you've watched any of my previous Pulse videos over the last 6 months, I've been talking about BRICS, and that the President of the United States will reveal to the world that the United States has, in fact, been a member of BRICS by way of the testing, utilizing synthetic transactions, the testing of the U.S. CBDC through the Bank for International Settlements, which is the bank of BRICS. They've been testing with members of the BRICS nations, and the soon-to-be admitted member countries into BRICS, so they consider this now BRICS Plus, that the United States will reveal through Donald Trump that it's been testing and therefore has been a member of BRICS quietly behind the scenes since 2021. And we've published the actual articles, the evidence in our monthly, well, now quarterly, Entangled magazine, available to our subscribers at anthonypatch.com. We've been printing the evidence to that statement. Greenland will bring the United States into BRICS by depositing the assets of Greenland into the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which will then be announced as the central bank's digital currency, which interfaces with the BIS and placing the U.S. firmly within BRICS. That's what's coming. So in the last couple of moments, I want to mention something that's referred to as tokenization. Tokenization is assigning a digital value to a physical asset. That can be people, that can be rare earth metals, precious metals, real estate, land that is held by a government, buildings that is held by a government. Globally, everything in the new economic system, the new blockchain system, the method by which you achieve a new global economic system under a global dictator, which is the Antichrist, the way that that is accomplished is through the tokenization of anything that is considered to be of value, as I said, including people. It is a digital representation of that asset. It is the digitizing action of an asset. I've spoken at length about this with our subscribers, but I'll give you just a very quick summation. The bullet point, if you will, the end point, the punchline. Greenland in its entirety and all that is Greenland will be tokenized. They will be digitized into the blockchain system. This is how Greenland is placed in the sovereign wealth fund. It is placed into the basket of assets, all of which are tokenized. They are represented digitally in the blockchain system. Greenland will be tokenized, and its people. There will be a value assigned in total to Greenland. Greenland is for the Sovereign Wealth Fund, is for the CBDC. That CBDC will also be backed by physical gold in that Sovereign Wealth Fund. Donald Trump has already talked about this, and he has already said that he will raise the assessed value of the gold that the U.S. physically holds. He has hinted that he may, in fact, reassess that value with impunity to $20,000 an ounce. And that in the basket of stable coins issued as a CBDC. And you know from experience with cryptocurrencies themselves that outside of being a true stable coin, their value from their initial mining, that value is arbitrarily first established at its initial release. It is fiat, not backed by anything. Stablecoin is backed by physical assets. But the same process with impunity, Donald Trump will say what the total value of that total basket of assets, of tokenized assets, and the value of gold to $20,000 an ounce in that basket, along with all of these other assets, including Greenland, he will use that CBDC and his assigned, as the figurehead, his assigned value for each of those stable coins, which are CBDCs. So the final point here is that with his, as the figurehead, his determining the total value of the basket of assets supporting the stable coins issued by the U.S. government, he will declare that that offsets the government of the United States. Consider that with the backdrop of what's going on in Japan today with their bond market and the ripple effect to the US bond market, which is then the ripple effect to the global bond markets. This is the catalyst. This is what's pushing the timing of these events with Greenland. He needs to remove the possibility of US default on its financial obligations by quickly bringing in the stable coin backed by the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which includes Greenland. We're getting very close to his announcement of the stable coin, the central bank digital currency stable coin, the revaluing of gold prior to that announcement to 20,000 an ounce, because the bond market is collapsing. Greenland will be a possession of the United States, perhaps within a matter of days. So he's at Davos, Switzerland, meeting with the WEF tomorrow, and the principal topic for Donald Trump is Greenland. The timing is everything. I tend to sometimes, as I've done here in this presentation, be very point by point. It's not a lot of hyperbole in here and nonsense. Sometimes our discussions with our subscribers on live streams is a lot more lively, but sometimes it's like this. We have to go very deliberately, point by point, to connect the dots and to build the picture and to see the bigger picture of what is going on. I invite you to visit us at anthonypatch.com for more information, and if you choose to subscribe behind our paywall, where we can speak quite a bit more freely than I am permitted to on our 2 YouTube channels. And those of you that are here tonight as subscribers, thank you for making all of this possible. God bless you all, and good night.